to something else. But why do we have to repeat this? We know all this already from Sefer Breshit. This is the beginning of Sefer Shemot, tuning us into a shift happening. We are moving from individuals, from a big family to a nation. That shift is about to happen, and that shift happens super quickly, right? We burst onto the scene in Egypt. We saw a piece last week from Leon Cass who described it as something like being in touch with Egypt was a very fertile land. It had the Nile, and things grew quickly and were very lush. We, as a people settling into Egypt, took on that attribute of Egypt, and we ourselves became very fertile. And so we hear in Pasuk Zayin, Bnei Yisrael, Haru v'yishretzu v'yirbu v'yatzmu b'ma'od ma'od, v'timalei ha'aretz hatam. Of course, we looked at the Midrashim last week, and you're welcome to look at your source sheet to go through them. On the miraculous nature of the surge in the size of the Jewish people. It was miraculous. Women were carrying 6 fetuses at one time. There weren't miscarriages, etc., etc. And I'll just remind you of Reb Amital, who looked at this and said, this is we saw last week a lot of sources that looked at the beginning of Sefer Shemot and said, this is not just this story in a capsule, this in a vacuum, this is the story of the Jewish people again and again in many ways. And so you'll remember the Ramban's introduction to the book of Shemot said, this is the story of moving from Galut to Geulah, from exile to redemption, and it is the story that recurs throughout Jewish history. And the Ramban, I'll remind you, believed in 2 very big principles. One was the concept of Ma'aseh Avot Siman Lebanim, that everything that happens to our biblical ancestors recurs throughout history. Of course, we have free will. Of course, we can do things differently. But there's a certain cycle that happens within Jewish history again and again, such as moving into the diaspora, becoming comfortable, becoming big as a people, and then some sort of threat happening, which affects that and shakes things up. And so that is a story that happens again and again. The Ramban was also a huge Zionist. Of course, all the Mefarshim was kind of Zionist. I mean, there wasn't Zionism back then in the Middle Ages, but we know that he in particular had a shita. He writes about it in his Perush, that the mitzvot are actually kind of like practicing, and that only truly fulfilled when you do them in the land of Israel. We do them in Chutz La'aretz, but it's almost like just so we don't forget what to do, okay? This is not a across-the-board shita, it's Ramban's view, and he himself moved to Israel at the end of his life. It was very disappointing what he saw when he first moved here. And so reminding you that this, when he speaks about these things of moving from Galut to Geulah, he lived this. This was his personal experience, which he's bringing to us in his introduction to Sefer Shemot. Okay, a few other points that I want to remind you of before we go forward, because we need to keep them with us. Rav Amital spoke about the distinction between names, which we have in the beginning of Sefer Shemot. We move very quickly from names and individuals to a people, to a group, to numbers. Suddenly we're numbers, we're growing, right? And that's a good thing. At the same time, Rav Amital, who himself was a Holocaust survivor, reminds us of the danger of being only numbers, of getting lost when you're just huge and numerous and spreading out. And so he writes about the importance of balancing these 2 things, which Sefer Shemot presents us with. How do we keep our heritage from Yaakov Avinu, the tribes, the faith of Yaakov, and at the same time become the Jewish people, become enormous, spread out, become big, and not lose that identity, okay? And of course, the name Shemot itself means names. Which is names, of course, are very much tied to identity, and we'll see. We're going to look into that topic a little more today. One of the most striking things we see in the beginning of Shemot is that who names Israel as a nation for the first time? You'll remember Paro, not God, not Moshe, not right, but Paro, right? Paro uses the language in the beginning of Sefer Shemot. In verse Tet. Vayomer Alamo, Hine'am b'nei Israel, Rav v'atzum mimeni, right? He says, Hine'am b'nei Israel. The first time the Jewish people are referred to as Am b'nei Israel is in the mouth of Paro. That was verse 9, Pasuk Tet. And so this is, in a way, the challenge of being a Jew throughout Jewish history. how do we define ourselves? Do we define ourselves, do we self-define? Or are we defined by the world around us? Are we defined by an oppressor, by other, by someone who is against us? Or are we defining ourselves aspirationally and without that negativity, right? Is it a positive identity or is it a negative identity? And that is one of the challenges.
It's like when we choose to like separate and not identify ourselves as a whole, some, unsavory character comes and says, no, you're all the same, and there's something not great happens.
Wait, so when we characterize not as a whole, you're saying?
Right, when we're separated,
when
we're
we
not
have
identifying
divisions.
ourselves as,
When we have divisions
one
within ourselves.
right, then that leaves a vacuum for some villain to say,
Yes.
well, sorry, I can't.
Unfortunately, we know this from the past year, what we've lived through, that we know that analysts have said that when Muslim countries and our enemies looked at us being so divisive from within, they knew that's when they're weak, that's when to attack, 100%. Okay, so now we're going to finish up this first source sheet before we move to the next sheet. So I wanted to highlight, having looked at the traditional sources, which touch on these themes of name versus number, of identity, of names, and of the introduction to the Jewish nation, and just show you a little bit about how this relates to this theme continues through modern times. So if you look, for instance, at source 8, we're on the source sheets that say the birth of Am Yisrael and the beginnings of anti-Semitism. Do you have that one? Okay, so hang on. Are there extras of that? Okay, just share and then I'll send it to you. We're only going to spend a couple of more minutes on this. Okay, so if you don't have it, share and I can definitely get more printed. So we're going to get to that today. We're just finishing up from last week. Okay, so source 8, I want to read to you from a piece that was published in Mosaic magazine by Daniel Gordis. Some of you may read him. He's quite an influencer, quite an opinionated thinker on Israel, a great defender of Israel. Okay, and he says as follows in source 8. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. The Eretz Yisrael Kam Ha'am HaYehudi begins Israel's Declaration of Independence. So he raises a really fascinating point. Should we close this window? Is it bothering people? Or okay, if it starts to bother people, go ahead and close it. When we say in Megillah HaAtzmaut, the language is a little vague in Hebrew, right? The Eretz Yisrael Kam Ha'am HaYehudi. The Jewish nation sprung up in the land of Israel. How would you translate it? Yeah, rose up. Interestingly, in the English version, it says Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Now, of course, this is a very contentious issue today. And here we are reading Sefer Shmot. And Sefer Shmot says, where were the Jewish people truly born? Well, how do we decide? Are we talking about our oldest ancestors like Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? Okay, so at least most of them made it there or were born there. But Am Yisrael technically was born in Egypt. That's what we're seeing now. And we have a really big question we're going to look at today. Why did we come to be a nation in Galut, in Egypt? I think it's in the end a good thing, but why? Okay, so he says, no. Maybe Sinai, but okay. You have to be careful. This is being recorded. Okay, it's an iconic sentence, but is it true? The Bible seems to suggest that it isn't. On numerous occasions, the Torah states that it was not in the land of Israel, but elsewhere that the Israelites became a people. The first person to designate the Israelites a people in Hebrew, Am, was Paro. Look, the people of the sons of Israel is more numerous and vaster than we. Come, let us be shrewd with them, lest they multiply. A few chapters later, it is God who speaks of the Jews becoming a people. Here too, they are in Egypt. I will take you out from under the burdens of Egypt, and I will rescue you from their bondage. And I will take you to me as a people, and I will be your God. Later in the desert, he says, you will become to me a kingdom of priests and a holy people. Encamped in the deserts of Moab and the eastern side of the Jordan River, it is Moshe who says, be still and listen, Israel. This day you've become a people. None of these are said while the people are in the land of Israel. So he is raising, it's a great article, you can go on to read it, raising a really good points. Here, it could be that we truly became who we are when we got to Eretz Yisrael. At the same time, it's a little bit delicate, and it's certainly not so simple to explain on social media to a lot of people in the world today. And he's putting his finger onto that, and we're going to get back to this. Yeah.
But it's delicate, it's the translation.
Right. Right. Which is really interesting. Right, the original Hebrews, this is where we rose up to be a people. Right, exactly, and that's what he says. He talks about Kam being related to komemiut, to standing up upright. This is where we can truly stand upright as a people, when we have this nation. And you see it today, you see it during this era, this new era of
Like
anti-Semitism.
having sovereignty, so for yourselves. When you rise up, you become
Yes.
sovereign nation, which you can't do in any other place.
100%. So, but why? Why didn't Hashem could have had it some other way? Why were we born in Egypt as a people? Why did we become a people in Egypt? Why didn't we become a people when we were in the land, only when we entered the land of Israel?
To experience the process of how we become.
So I think that's a big piece of it.
Yeah.
So I think this is really a big piece of it. And that is, we're gonna see, we're gonna see the sources that relate to this. But very much, that's definitely the approach here. Before we get to that, so we have a double layer of questions here. One is, why did we have to become a people in Egypt, Dafka? The other thing is, why did we have to go through the process of enslavement? Why did we have to go from Avdut lecherut? Why? Of course, we know that this goes back to Bereshit, to the promise of the covenant that God made with Abraham, where God says, you're gonna go to Egypt, and you're gonna be enslaved there. So we know that it was predicted, it was our destiny. But why did it have to be that way? Okay, so this is a question that's asked by Mefarshim and is also asked really beautifully by Leon Kass, modern paper on the book of Shmot. And here's what he says in source 9. The story of how the Israelites became a people begins with their enslavement in Egypt. And we may wonder why such a first step was thought necessary or desirable. The Lord could have chosen other ways to forge Israel's national identity and character. How might reduction to bondage contribute positively and negatively to people formation in general and to this people in particular? So before you read on, don't look at the resource sheet anymore. Let's debate this. What are the positives and negatives of having rose up as a people out of the state of Avdut? Okay, why is this? Why? What we'll see as we're going to see sources that talk about this throughout the course. Hang on one second here. Hang on one second. Yetziat Mitzrayim, right, is a huge. Think about how many mitzvot in Torah are based on Yetziat Mitzrayim, right? It relates to so many different mitzvot. Okay. And we have it in Shema. It's connected to Kiddush and Shabbat. I could go on. It's a huge part of our story of how we do Judaism, how we practice Judaism. And this experience of moving from slavery to freedom defines us. So positives and negatives. 10.
So, first is that we have to understand the concept of dependence. It's what connected to its dependence, right? And the second is.
Wait, so the concept of dependence?
Depends on our shape.
Okay, okay.
Second is that the building into us as a nation, eventually the concept of knowing what it is to be the underdog, so that we could want to be that today, that we can understand, like, you know, in terms of relating to humanity.
Beautiful. So it instills within us humility and faith in Hashem, and it also instills within us compassion. We will always remember that experience is in our DNA.
Also to give us a story, huge story that everybody else would also see. That we could remember, like, I guess every day and obviously in holidays, but like the huge story that, you know, everybody else see who God is for us and for them, I guess.
Excellent. So this is very much a Rabbi Sachs approach, and based on tradition of telling the story. Telling the story is about reliving that experience throughout history. Did that? Anyone else? What about a negative? What's a negative of going from Avdut to Beirut?
Not everybody was able to make the transition.
Great, right? We know only, the Midrashim tell us only a fifth came out of Egypt, and even that fifth didn't do so. They struggled. They didn't make it all the
That
way.
whole generation died out, so that they couldn't take off this slavery out of their
Fantastic.
mindset.
It's not an easy mindset to get out of. Okay, so let's see. This is basically sums up a lot of what Leon Kass brings. I just summarized because it was long. Some of the positives are that it's the people acquire a common enemy against which to define themselves and unite, which is interesting, right? So Am Yisrael, right? When they reach their breaking point, they cry out to God. Okay, when did they decide to be redeemed, to leave Egypt? Only when things got really bad for them. This is, again, always our challenge. Are we coming to Hashem? Are we coming to Torah? Are we coming to faith through oppression or through a positive association? Okay, what else? Like a blank state, we're like a blank slate in terms of identity, okay? When we go from Abdut to Beirut, we are Ephes, okay? We are so humble, this relates to what Tammy was saying, we're so humble that we're like a vessel ready to receive God's Torah. What else? Coming from experience of oppression should shape how they behave when in power, okay? When you come from, this is a very interesting one, okay? These are very deep ideas, we're running through them. When you come having lived under a tyrant, right? You know how you should behave when you do get into power. Now, this is one that has not been relevant for a long time, but has become relevant and is relevant right now, right? Extremely relevant. So you see this also with dissidents from the former Soviet Union or from Iran, people who have left countries up with oppressors, North Korea. They're able to say those in leadership need to be different. So we should be able to say, this is how we should lead differently, okay? It's a very powerful point. Through being in a low state and experiencing vulnerability, we're more open to discovering God, exactly like Tam said. And the negatives are less than the positives. One is that remind me your name. Rachel pointed out they have a slavish mentality. That's what the Uncast called it. They're slavish, right? Like it's hard to break that.
That's a self.
I know, but my bad. I wrote it bad. Sorry, my typo, slavish. You can fix it. And second, they are open to lawlessness or tyranny because they are not empowered. So that happens, right? We see that happens amongst, we have the Erev Rav, and they quickly go to Chet HaEgel. They're impressionable because they're not strong, they're not empowered, they're not independent. So we have the negatives, but clearly Hashem felt the positives would outweigh the negatives. Okay. I want to just wrap up with these final sources, and then we'll go to today's class really, which is that when we look at the early Zionists, we're going to try to do some of this. I'm not doing this all the time in this course, but we're going to try to bring Zionist thinkers and a little bit more Israeli culture and history into this class. So we're talking a lot about identity in Tanakh. So we're going to relate it to identity today. So if you look in the beginning at the political Zionists, a lot of what they're writing is only one aspect of this, right? What did Herzl say? We need a state, right? We need to have nationhood because that's the only way we're going to survive. That's the only way we're not going to be oppressed. In source 11, just the bolded line, Max Nordau writes, anti-Semitism has also taught many educated Jews the way back to their people. This is a very powerful statement. Look what's going on in our world today, right? Elon Levy, right, said Gen Z, Gen Zionists, like we're seeing on the one hand, a lot of anti-Israel hatred, but we're also seeing Jews coming into their own identity. Dafka in this sort of black space, empty space that is when they suddenly had no Jewish identity, but people are saying to them, you're a Jew, you're a Zionist, you're not allowed into this club in this university, then suddenly they're like, oh, I'm a Jew, I'm a Zionist, hey. And so that is part of what went on also in the beginning of the Zionist movement. We had on the one hand, terrible anti-Semitism, and on the other hand, nationalism became very popular. And so those two things fed into the burst of political Zionism. But when that's all it's about, it's not enough, right? It's not enough that we just have a state of Israel protect Jews from anti-Semitism. We know that is not enough. We've seen that. It has to be more than that. And that is what I think more modern thinkers have brought, certainly religious Zionists, right? Which we'll hopefully have a chance to look at throughout the course, like Rav Kook, had a different message. It wasn't just about anti-Semitism. It was about also the ideal. This is where we should be, all through Tanakh. Eretz Yisrael is where we're meant to be, okay? And so it's infused with meaning, okay? I'll just quote this one excerpt from Rav Yaakov Meidan. Rav Meidan, of course, is from one of the Rosh Yeshiva of the Gush. And he's become known recently for having a son who was critically injured, lost both his legs. Elisha Meidan, perhaps you've seen him on social media, an unbelievable hero and role model of strength. So, but before that, Rav Meidan was also famous for doing something quite bold. He sat down with I think in the 90s, by 2003, they put it out. He sat down with a relatively secular professor, okay, called Ruth Gabbason, and they sat down together. He, this frum Dati Leumi rabbi from the Gush, and she, this, pretty secular woman professor, sat down, Dati Filoni, and said, let's write a covenant, let's write a brit, okay? It's well known, it's still out there, people still look to it. They wrote a brief, they wrote a guideline for how things can work in this country for both Dati and Filoni to feel they can, to feel that they are part of the same country, to feel that they are.
Why do we know that?
Oh, it's out, yes, you can look it up, and it's called, the Gabbason Meidan, I'm not sure if it's called the covenant, but this is their statement of principle. It was something they put out, it was a paper. All the politicians have, most politicians have read it. It's a vision for the future of Israel. So look at what they together wrote. This is not just him, they wrote this together. The Jews are one family, the offspring of our 3 patriarchs and 4 matriarchs, a single historical unit. The Jewish people, delivered out of Egypt by the Almighty, joined in a mutual covenant with God on Mount Sinai. Okay, so where is our beginning point? Our beginning point is Am Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, but that's the beginning point. It takes us to Har Sinai, to receiving the Torah, okay, to making a Brit Sinai. The Jewish people entered this covenant as a people and not as individuals, and the commandments we keep have a collective, not individual significance. This is the meaning of the mutual responsibility that connects all Jews, which refers not only to a shared struggle for existence and mutual aid, but also to the collective fulfillment of the commandments required to uphold the Sinai covenant. Mutual responsibility became even more powerful once a distinct association was established for the sake of a single purpose, a single ship. I love this metaphor, a single ship, the state of Israel. The division between Jews and Israelis, when juxtaposed against a large Arab population with a distinct national and religious identity having no connection to the state of Israel, will weaken us and jeopardize our existence here. So they talk about how to have laws and a vision for how Shabbat should be in this country. And we have here a representative from the Filoni camp and from the Dati Leumi camp saying this is the vision for how things can work in Israeli society. You're welcome to look it up. The Gabbason Meidan, I don't know if it's called covenant or document.
Say what they discussed about Shabbat.
Not off the cuff because I don't remember, but
For an example of something.
I'll tell you, I'll find the excerpts and I'll send them to you.
Nobody's talking about it, Chabad. It seems like
It's
now
from
would be like-
2003.
I know, but now might be a good time to.
Every couple of years, people try to revisit this issue. You have here in Ra'anana, there's big debates about, right, what's gonna happen, different Azarim, where things are gonna be open, where things aren't gonna be open. We're in a process of growth, and it's not, there's a lot of, I'll share that in my 19 years of living here, I've never felt ever that anyone has said something negative to me for being religious. I've never been, mostly because I'm in a lot of religious environments, but in my interactions with different kinds of people around Israel, I've never felt that. I had an experience a few weeks ago where someone got upset with me in the Makolet, and she was quite upset, and she said something along the lines of Roim sheyesh lach kova al harosh. Okay, you see you have a hat on your head. Now, I'm sure they also, people who are Chiloni, right, whatever, she thought she could cut into the line, whatever. Doesn't matter what the case was, but the point is, I'm like, no, I am not letting you cut me in the line, but that's not the point. The point is, it's okay to have a fight about who's cutting who in the line. It's not okay to make a comment about the Kisui Rosh. And I don't know if this is.
Feedback.
We'll talk about it after.
Recording.
What?
Did you say what into some context?
Of course not.
Exactly.
Yeah,
I don't know.
it's terrible, right? But I also see that there's what it's saying to me is, and I've actually heard about other people having. I think this is happening more. I think we're keying into the fact that people first of all have gotten very separate, right? They've always been separate. They're still separate. We're not interacting with each other. And so then there's the people who work in high-tech firms with all kinds of different Jews in Israel will not make comments like that. It's people who are living in a bubble, who are angry about something in particular, right? And so these are our challenges. These are our challenges. The point is, I don't remember if it talks about Gius. I don't think so. I'm not sure. Yeah, well, I think we know. Okay, so I want to pull us back now to our sources. But I wanted to just show you, just give you a taste of how this question of what does it mean to be an Am Yehudi? Is it that Paro saying there's these people who are genetically Jews? Or is it that we have a common bond? And if we have a common bond, what is our common bond? What it is in Tanakh may be very different from what it is in Israel today and what it is as the entire Jewish people in the world today. And these are things that need to be thought about. Okay, I'll read you one last source, just source 13, because really, I've recently discovered this guy, Tal Becker, and he's amazing if you can hear him ever. He lives in Yerushalayim. He's a lawyer and he's been involved in a lot of diplomacy. Anyone who listens to Dan Senor's podcast, Call Me Back, may have heard him, and he's just fantastically articulate. And look at what he said. Sorry? Oh, that's right. Amazing. So he's doing the really good work for Israel. And listen, when he has this beautiful idea. You've heard about political Zionism, religious Zionism, secular Zionism, right? Could you be more tribal? He says we need a new movement and we need to call it aspirational Zionism. Okay, I love this term. And he says as follows. Unlike political Zionism that underpins this crisis model, promoting a state that defines its Jewishness in minimalistic and largely, if not exclusively, survivalist terms, and a discussion about Israel, it has to be a discussion about Israel founded on values, he says. The unique opportunity and responsibility that comes with belonging to a people 3,500 years old. The question it seeks to address is not, how do we survive? It is this, as custodians of an ancient story, as bearers of a particular moral tradition, and as a people shaped by a particular historical experience, what form and nature should a Jewish sovereign society take? I mean, the kind of Zionism that a values narrative engenders, one which imagines Israel not as a normal state, but as a state which gives public expression to the unique history and tradition of the Jewish people. We've matured, we've evolved. When 1948, we needed a state, all we wanted was to be normal people in our own state. So we stopped being killed by everyone else around the world. Now we're in a different place. Now we have a challenge. Now we have to decide, we're not just a normal state. We're more than that, okay? When we're Am Skula, okay, we still have to think about what that means when we get into power, when we have Jewish power in the state of Israel. What is that aspirational Zionism going to look like? And how are we going to reflect on our history, right, as an entire people now to promote that? Okay, we're going to put this source sheet aside and turn to names and meaninglessness. No, you guys can read that on your own. Sometimes I bring too much, sorry. Sorry, yeah. That was all, we just didn't finish the word pack last week. Yeah. Okay, now do you, names and namelessness, you don't have it, I'll give you this one. All right. Okay, so now we're in the source sheet, names and namelessness, right? Okay. Yes, but
unity from the ground up, and there's so much divisiveness.
there was, but we're all a product of the time we live, and you know, they were just trying to survive in 1948 and now we're Baruch Hashem, we're in a different period of Zionism of the state of Israel. Okay. Have to open it here. Here we go. So, so I want to begin again, get back to our question. Why did we become a nation in the Gola? We talked a little, and why did we start as slaves? And what's going on in the beginning of Sefer Shemot? Okay, so first of all, I wanted to share with you that in the end of Breshit, at the end of Breshit, we are told why we go down to Egypt. And I'm just going to remind you of the language because we're going to see that the language is reflected on soon, is interpreted. If you look at source 1, in Breshit chapter 47, there are 2 verses that explain why we went out to Egypt. As you might remember, there was a famine, and the brothers, Yaakov sent the brothers down, and they discover there that Yosef, right? That's the whole story of discovering Yosef is there and he's alive. And in the end, Yosef sets up a system where Yaakov and his family can come dwell in a specific area, okay, a ghetto, if you, in Goshen, right? They get their own little area, right? The Jewish quarter of Egypt, called Goshen. And so the language is like this. Vayomru al Paro, lagur ba'aretz banu, ki ein mir'eh latzon asher la'abadecha, ki chaved harav ba'aretz Canaan, v'ata yeshvuna avadecha ba'aretz Goshen. We have come, they told Paro, to live in this land, lagur, to sojourn in this land. For we can't feed our flocks because the famine is so great in Canaan. So they say, please let us, let us dwell in the region of Goshen. Okay, so far so good. Now, in all the cycles of the Avot going down to Egypt during a famine, what happens? Do they stay there or do they come back eventually? Eventually they come back. They come back to Canaan, right? They leave for a famine and they come back to Canaan. Now, we don't hear that in this story. This story is different. In verse 27, we hear, Vayeshev Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen, Vayechazu ba, Vayifru vayirbu ma'od. Interestingly, we already hear in Breshit that they're becoming fertile, okay? But again, we had a recap at the beginning of Sefer Shemot. Now, what is the language here? They settle in the land, okay? Not only do they settle, but Vayechazu ba. What does that mean? Anyone who knows about Rehova Huza, right? It's a stronger language, right? It's they like really settled, okay? I'll just really quickly, when I made Aliyah the first time, it was a long time ago after college, I met my husband from England, and then we went back to New York, and it was supposed to be for 2 years, but for various reasons, it got delayed 7 years. My mom knows the story. But when we were there, we always said, we're not going to settle down because we want to come back to Israel. So we didn't buy a house, we only rented. We didn't buy a car, we rented a car. Everything was just, so it was temporary. And then we got stuck for a little while and we realized we were outgrowing our apartment. So we started to look at houses. And that one day we went to look at houses and then we said to buy, and then we just looked at each other and said, oh my goodness, what are we doing? And it's this language, right? Of am I here, zmani, temporarily, or am I here, right here? I think all of us are olim, all of us understand what it is to try and uproot, to try and move, and the challenges of Aliyah. But to get super settled in Chutz La'aretz is another level. That's not what the intention was here for Yaakov's family, okay? And so we'll get back to that in a moment. When we talked about Shemot, you'll remember we talked last week about this tension between the names and the namelessness, that we have the names of the tribes, and then suddenly there are no more names, right? We're just a group of people, and there's a big question in the Mefarshim. Where did our names go? Why don't we have names anymore? Okay, and so there's 2 approaches taken to this. One is to say, we talked about this last week, that we lost our identity, we lost our names. We suddenly don't have our identity. The other is to say that that actually even in the hardship of Egypt, Am Yisrael managed to keep being Yisrael. We were just larger and we were enslaved, so we were less individuals, but we generally kept our traditions. There were 2 midrashic traditions that stand out for that. Just if you look at source 2, this is the basis of it. Rav Huna Amar B'Shem Bar Kapara B'Shpil Arba'at Barim Nigalu Yisrael Mimitzrayim. So here the Midrash, don't ask why it's in Vayikra Rabbah, but on the book of Vayikra. For 4 reasons, Israel was redeemed from Egypt. Okay, and what are these things? Lo shinu et shmam, they didn't change their names. Okay, ve'et lashonam, they didn't change their language, they still spoke Hebrew. V'lo amru lashon hara, wow. V'lo nimtzu b'neihem echad mehen parutz ve'erva, and they did not engage in illicit sexual activity. Okay. And the basis for the fact that they didn't change their names is that interesting is they still call them Ruvain, B'Shimon, okay? And not, the Midrash says not Luliani and Lestus, and this must be Greek and Roman names because this is being written in the time of Chazal, in the time of the Talmudic sages. So what do we see here? And this is really so much of the story of Jewish history, right? When we stay enclosed, when we stay separate, when we are able to keep our language, be it Hebrew or Aramaic in Babel or Ladino or Yiddish, right? Then we're able to preserve our identity. But when we spread out and when we lose that, then we lose our names. Great special visitor. Okay, and so this is a very positive view of Am Yisrael in Egypt. This is saying, okay, that they didn't assimilate. Okay, so we can read the beginning of Sefer Shemot in 2 completely different ways. It's kept totally open. One is that they didn't assimilate at all, and the other is that they did. So look at what the Sforno says, Rav Ovadia Sforno, an Italian commentary in Source 3. He says, Eila Shmot, the ones mentioned here were deserving to be mentioned with their names. The reason is that each one of them possessed sufficient individuality to give meaning to his name. They were all of them an inspiration to their children, as not one of them abandoned his family tradition. So when it says, Eile Shmot, Bnei Yaakov, right, the children of Jacob, Reuven, Shimon, etc., in that generation, they kept their tradition. But what happened? They got comfortable, and their children and their grandchildren started to assimilate. However, after the death of that generation, even the relatively righteous ones among them did not rate so highly in the eyes of God or man, so that the Torah deemed it necessary to tell us their names. Meaning, why don't we know their name, their identity? Because it was not anything worth noting about them. You guys asked me last week about the number 70 and going down to Egypt, and we said, wait, what about all the women? And the Midrash tells us it only included a couple of women who we know by name, Serach Bat Asher and Yocheved, okay? And that bothered you guys. I totally get why that bothers you. But in general, in Tanakh, people are counted when they are part of the story, when their names are remembered for being noteworthy. And so what the beginning of Shemot, and we're going to see some women in a moment, very much named. But what's happening here is when they become numbers and not names, it's a sign that they've lost who they are, that they're not, they've distanced themselves from their identity. So look at what Nechama Leibowitz says. This is very powerful in her introduction to Sefer Shemot in source 4. Like all the other calamities that have overtaken us, this is a little strong, I have to warn you. Like all the other calamities that have overtaken us, this exile too was a punishment for sin. So maintained many of our rabbis. Sin in this context felt the desire to assimilate. The children of Jacob, as was deliberately emphasized by them in their first encounter with Pharaoh, entered Egypt merely to stay there temporarily. But as the text informs us, they not only stayed there, the Hebrew is lagur, they settled. They settled there, yashevu. What is more, vayechazuba, they secured a permanent foothold. This was their sin, and for this they were punished. Their settlement and permanent foothold turned into exile and bondage. Okay. She quotes the Hamak Davar, who says a similar idea. And then she goes on to say, there are other midrashim which regard the suffering or exile not as punishment, but as inspired by an educational purpose. Exile and suffering are for a refining and purification of character. So when it says in Dvarim, he brought you out of the iron furnace of Egypt to be his people, what it's saying is that, and here we're getting back to our deep question of why did we have to become a nation in the land of Egypt? One is, it's our fault, right? Theologically, we messed up, we assimilated, we distanced ourselves, and so we wound up falling into bondage, and that's why we started there. Another possibility is that this is how God wanted. This was the plan, right? The plan was that we needed to start there to understand. We always have to carry with us that story of what can happen, what it can be like the vulnerability and fragility of what it is to be a people in a land that's not our own, right? To keep our identity as a nation without having security, okay, and safety. And so we had to go through this process to understand that. The third point, she says, the Torah itself supplies a more specific reason for exile, an educational one, which draws on the experience of Egyptian exile and bondage as a motive for observing the commandments. Do not wrong a stranger, and do not oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Just as the Egyptian exile prefigures every exile to which Israel was subjected, and just as the Egyptian bondage provided the motivation and impulse for many moral imperatives, so did the redemption from Egypt serve as a spur for religious duty that imposed on every Jew to redeem his fellow being from the slavery he had been reduced to for lack of means. We have 3 reasons for why we had started out in Egypt. One is because we messed up, and so we were punished. The second is that it was a process we had to go through, okay? A process we had to go through to reach a higher level of faith and commitment. And the third one is that, similar to what Tammy said before, that by going through the experience of being the vulnerable person, of being the oppressed, we will always look out in the world, keep the mitzvot better, be drawn to the mitzvot, and they should make us more compassionate.
What was the first one?
The first one was that we assimilated, and so God punished. So we have here 3 possibilities. Now I want to read with you, move on to the next section of Sefer Shemot, chapter 2, where we're introduced finally to Moshe. And this is going to get us till next week, through to next week, where we're introduced to Moshe. Okay, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe, the greatest leader of the Jewish people of all time. So what do we see here? So we'll read together, and as always, I encourage interaction, and note, it's very literary, what's emphasized, what's absent, what strikes you. So, source 5. Vayelach ish מבית לוי, ויקח את בת לוי. ותר האישה ותלד בן, ותראה אותו כי טוב הוא, ותצפנהו 3 ירחים. Okay, so a man from the house of Levi took a woman as wife who's the daughter of Levi, and she becomes pregnant, and she has a boy. She sees he is ki tov, and she hides him for 3 months. Okay, now why is she hiding him? We know already that Paro has decreed to kill all the firstborn males. ולא יכלה עוד הצפינו, ותיקח לו תיבת גומד, ותחמרה, בחמר ובזפת, ותשם בה את הילד, ותשם בסוף על שפת היור. She puts him in the teva, and there's a lot of detail about how it's made, and puts it on the Nile. ותתעצב אחותו מרחוק לדעה מה יעשה לו. And his sister, who we know later is Miriam, stands on the side to watch what will be with him. ותרד בת פרעה לרחוץ על היאור, ונערותיה הולכות על יד היאור, ותראה את התיבה בתוך הסוף, ותשלח את המטה ותיקחיה. So, בת פרעה, how convenient, how fortuitous, thank you. Bat Paro goes down to the yard at this moment to have a swim, and she's with her ladies in waiting, and they go to the Yaor, to the Nile, and they see the Teva. And she herself, Bat Paro, pulls the Teva in.
I mean, is that the plan? Like, what mother would do that? I don't understand
Well,
how could the mother, why would she do that?
Okay, we'll talk about that. Hang on. Okay. ותפתח ותראהו את הילד, והנה נער בוכה ותחמול עליו, ותאמר מילדי העברים זה. So Bat Paro looks in and sees this boy who's crying, this baby boy, and she has compassion for him, and she also sees he's one of the Hebrews, okay? But which is an interesting question. How does she know? Perhaps from the Brit Milah. ותאמר אחותו אל בת פרעה, האלך וקראתי לך אישה מנקת מן העבריות ותניק לך את הילד. So his sister, who's standing by, swoops in and says to Bat Paro, should I go and call a nursemaid, someone to nurse the baby from the Hebrew women, and to breastfeed the baby? In verse 8, ותאמר לה בת פרעה, לכי ותלך העלמה ותקרא את אם הילד. This is This works out very conveniently, very fortuitously, perhaps through Yad Hashem, that Yocheved, Moshe's mother, is called to breastfeed her own son. V'tomer labat paro, helichi et hayeled hazeh v'henikehu li, v'ani eten et tzarech v'tikach ha'isha hayeled v'tinikehu. Okay, so bat paro says to her, take this child, nurse him, and I will pay you. And she took him and took care of him, nursed him. When he gets a little bit bigger, in verse 10, Vaydal hayeled v'tavi'eu levat paro, v'hila leben, v'tikra shmo Moshe, v'tomer ki min hamayim meshitihu. The boy grows up a little, the baby grows, he's old enough to be given back to Bat Paro, and she takes him in as a son, and she calls him Moshe. Why? She says, because from the water I drew him, Meshitihu. Okay. Very powerful section of the story. What struck you as significant? What struck you as absent, as missing?
Well, the first thing is the lack of the names with the mystery great Levi and Bat Levi. Because the thing, it's really wild, the whole Paro. And just think about now that Moshe went back to Goshen, to your heaven. How did this even, were there guards around? I mean, there must have been help,
Yeah, it's.
How did they manage to raise a male child without getting, how did she explain this to Paro? Where did this child suddenly come from to have?
So presumably he had the protection of Bat Paro, and that's how he was able to survive. It's very, the delicateness of the situation is unbelievable, right? It's totally miraculous in many ways. So there's a couple, first of all, I just want to go back to the point about names, right? Names and namelessness is the title of today's class. First of all, a man from Beit Levi takes a woman from, everyone is anonymous in this section, everyone. Takes a wife who's the daughter of Levi, okay? So we don't have a name for either of them. We find out later it's Amram and Yocheved, Moshe's parents, but why not name them? Miriam is referred to here always as Achoto, his sister, never her own name, okay? In a story which is so much about names, Ve'ela Shmot, why is everyone nameless, okay? And of course, this is something we're grappling with through this class, but why are they all nameless? And then we have Bat Paro is only known as the daughter of Paro. We don't have a name for her. And
Does
the
her
ladies,
father know?
it's a good question. We don't know, okay? And
Charles told you connect with it,
yeah, that's true. And the nursemaid, who it turns out we know is Yocheved, all these women, all these people, even Ish mi Beit Levi, complete anonymity, no names, no identity. It's, if you just pause for a moment and think about it, it's striking. Who is the only person who has a name in the story? Moshe. The story ends, the section ends with him being named, okay? Moshe, now we have to understand. Why is this? And what is the significance of his name? Now, who names him? Bat Paro, right? It's very.
This is the repetition. Paro naming Israel.
Aha.
Naming Moshe. The insignificance of the individuals until Moshe brings them together.
Beautiful, beautiful. But I would argue that Bat Paro is a very different personality than Paro. Right? Paro is saying that nation, which I'm intimidated by, and I have a feeling of hatred and resentment toward and fear of. And she's saying, no, she's all compassion, okay? And we'll see this also in how she names him. Anyone else want to add to that? So this aspect of names is something which is so central to the beginning of Sefer Shmot. And I want to share with you. First of all, we'll read you source 7, and then we're going to look at a famous poem from modern Israel. In source 7, Nechama Leibowitz again nails this so perfectly in the way she writes this. She says, the image of Israel conveyed in this chapter, in chapter 1, is cold and gray, with no description of nature or appearance, without any individual characters, with no outstanding personality, simply an oppressed, suffering mass devoid of heroes. Chapter 2, which we just read, is the opposite. Here, against the background of this colorless and faceless mass, one family stands out, a father, mother, daughter. Although at first they are anonymous, they have some character, some uniqueness. And here, the hero of the chapter is born. So beginning of Sefer Shemot is just setting up the stage. It's so literary, it's so beautiful, and it's so poignant, setting up the stage for the beginning of the Jewish people, which is a story that recurs, right? When we are strong in our identity or when we're weak in our identity, when we're growing in number, it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be strong, okay? And when we get back to, when we highlight the family who does come to save the Jewish people, there we see for the first time a name being given, a name. There's a famous poem which is often read at Kassim ceremonies in Israel by an Israeli poet called Zelda. She has this story, she has this poem, which I won't read the whole poem now, but it begins as follows, and you're welcome to read it. And it's actually, turns out Zelda, you may know of her from modern, she's mentioned in Israeli culture as an Israeli poet. Fascinatingly, she was a religious woman to the end of her life. Not only that, she was a cousin of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, of Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. Yes, actually her name was Zelda Schneerson something. And it turns out she knew a lot of Chassidut, and it appears in her poetry. And if you text me, I'll text you a fascinating article about her. And this is something which in fact, in the Lubavitcher Rebbe himself talks about names. I think I mentioned this last week, that names for him are very significant. And when you look at the name of every parsha, he often has something to say about the name of the parsha and its resonance, right? That the name itself is significant, it means something, and often has resonance for the week that you're reading it. It was a very Hasidic idea. And she says as follows, she writes as follows. By the way, just a fun tidbit. She had a sad life, a hard life. She came from Russia when she was 12, so she knew oppression, she knew hardship. Her family moved to Israel and Palestine then, and she didn't have the easiest life. And then she got married, and then her husband died, and then she died young of cancer. But she was a teacher, and she was actually, I read somewhere she was Amos Oz's teacher, which is quite amazing. Very cool fact. And she actually had a correspondence. We have letters of her corresponding with the Lubavitcher Rebbe and about her sadness, and he's trying to uplift her, which is very powerful. And she writes as follows: L'chol ish yashem shenatan lo Elokim v'natnu lo aviv ve'imo. Look how powerful. Everyone has a name that was given to him or her by God and by his father and mother. L'chol ish yashem. Each of us has a name given to us by our stature and our way of smiling, and given to us by our clothes. I'll read on in English. Each of us has a name given to us by the mountains, given to us by our walls. Each of us has a name given to us by the planets and given to us by our neighbors. Each of us has a name given to us by our sins and given to us by our logging. Each of us has a name given to us by our enemies and given to us by our love. Each of us has a name given to us by our fast days, given to us by our crafts. Each of us has a name given to us by the seasons of the year and given to us by our blindness. Each of us has a name given to us by the sea and given to us by our death. Very strong, very emotional, very powerful, very melancholy, I think. And she herself knew a lot of Tanakh and Midrash and Chassidut. And if you look before the poem in source 6, she literally is quoting Midrash Tanhuma here on Vayakhel, where it says there, a person is known by 3 names: the name by which his father and mother call him, and the name by which other men call him, and the one he earns for himself. The most important name is the one he earns for himself. Of course, she introduces God in there. And so I think we're out of time. We're going to look next time at why Moshe is called Moshe. What does it mean, and why Bat Paro names him? And we'll wrap up with that. And then we'll continue to talk about the birth of Moshe. But my point for today is that we see there's deep significance in the story of our origins, that we originate in Egypt, that we originate with this danger zone of having names and quickly assimilating and the potential of losing our names. And with all of that backdrop, that there always is the potential for people to stand up and be strong in their names and be strong in who they are. And that is how, by the way, in a place where if it's true that Am Yisrael in Egypt were running away from their name, were moving away from their name, distancing themselves, Moshe Dafka, we're going to see, jumps into his name. He goes from being an Egyptian prince to a leader of the Jewish people. And that becomes the template, the model. Okay, if you haven't signed up for class, please sign up, and I look forward to going in with you. It's a pleasure. So nice to see you here, Ricky.
So I know that we're like almost reading it. I go there, he's not.
Excuse me, we have a meeting in here now.
Let's go.
Welcome to stay and chat and have coffee in the lobby. Thank you.
It's the absence
Yeah.
of
Happy.
one that sort of develops.
To remind you of the need for, right? They didn't need to be reminded because they were those.